Yes, we learn words without trying. When we're listening to the language that we want to learn, we don't have to be consciously aware of everything we're learning. As long as we're paying attention and understanding what we're watching, our brain does the inventory work for us. This can be one of the most challenging things to believe when we sit down to learn a language. We have a general tendency to think that our brain only learns when we tell it exactly what it needs to learn. We treat our brain like a tool we pick up and operate, and we assume it sits there doing nothing until we explicitly command it to learn. We say, learn that, remember this, do that. But this just isn't how our brain works, and in this video, I'm going to thoroughly demonstrate that unconscious acquisition is not just something our brain can do. It's the engine that allows us to recognize everything. Firstly, let's challenge the idea that our brain needs us to use it like a tool. The idea that if we're not consciously examining something, then, well, our brain is in the off mode. We're not learning anything. If we're really the ones that are facilitating our brain's ability to recognize by consciously taking notes of everything we see, we'd expect that if we deprive ourselves of stuff to take notes on, well, our brains would just do nothing. But that's just not what happens, and there's a very, very strange experiment that proves this. You can do it in your house, but I wouldn't recommend you actually do this. There's a setup called Gansfeld, where the goal is to give the eyes a completely even field of light with no structure in it. You can do it by cutting a ping pong ball in half, taping the two halves over your eyes, and shining a soft red light at your face, usually with static playing through headphones. The goal is complete deprivation. Your eyes can't make out anything, your ears can't make out anything. After a few minutes of this, people start to see things, shapes, movements, and then often faces or entire scenes. This tells us something about the resting state of our brains. Our brain is never sitting and waiting for us to hand it something to learn. Finding patterns is what it does by default. When we give it nothing, it's still running that default state, trying to find something to make sense of. It looks for the smallest, tiniest drop of a pattern it can find, and it builds a whole world out of it. There is no off state for the brain. And this is why we've learned to recognize so many things that we've never sat down and consciously tried to learn to recognize. I'll wait to continue the video after you check your phone. Did somebody just open Netflix? All of these sounds have become a part of your mental model of the world, even though you never intentionally learned them. But you could be saying to yourself, well, all of those sounds are very obviously connected to specific things. A word in a language is much more complex. But if you close your eyes, I can play more complex soundscapes and you'll feel a very similar effect. If you have headphones, I'd put them on. Somehow, just by hearing scissors near your head, your brain reconstructs an entire environment around you and you know you're in a barbershop. Let's go to the next scene. Birds chirping at varying distances. Where do you normally hear that? A forest. So your brain constructs a forest around you. Here's an interesting one. Unlike the other examples, this isn't that compelling. Of course, rain sounds like rain. But if we change the sound to this, I can actually make you feel like you've changed locations. That means you don't just know how to identify what rain sounds like, you can identify where you are by what rain sounds like. And that's a level of complexity that does mirror words. Nobody sat you down and explained to you what rain sounds like when you're sitting in a car. If I asked you to describe what's actually different about it, what actually changes in the sound, you'd look at me like I was crazy. You'd have no idea. It's just rain outside and rain in a car. Who knows the difference in the sound quality? That's what exposure builds, not a definition we can recite, but a recognition precise enough to catch differences we were never told to look for and couldn't explain if we tried. To understand what rain sounds like inside a car, you need to have a comprehensible experience. You need a situation with enough contextual density for your brain to connect the experience of being in a car in the rain with that particular sound. So we just introduced two technical terms. Let's define them. A comprehensible experience is simply an experience where you understand the majority of what's happening. Contextual density is how much the stuff around some unknown piece tells you about that piece. Because you understand very basic things like cars have windshields, rain hits windshields, rain hitting windshields makes a sound. You're able to connect a sound with the situation. Obviously, if I played you that sound, but you never actually been in a rainstorm in a car, you wouldn't actually know that that sound relates to that experience. What allows us to learn unconsciously aren't just things happening around us. It's having a comprehensible experience. And we have a comprehensible experience when the contextual density is strong enough to pour meaning into the unknown piece or pieces. And that might sound technical, but it's actually very, very simple. We're going to see that right now. What I'm going to show you is how we can use situations with high contextual density to understand new words. I'm going to take an English word that you definitely know, change it to gibberish, read you 4 sentences with that word, and we're going to see if you can recognize the word simply from context. The word is knurl. Don't try to reason about what the word means, just try to understand the sentences. I didn't mean to knurl, the spider was just suddenly right there on my hand. She knurled so loud that the neighbors came outside to see what had happened. You could hear the knurls coming from the roller coaster all the way across the park. Her throat was raw the next morning from knurling for help. As we can see, with high contextual density, we're able to basically perfectly understand the gibberish word without actually defining it. The context shows us it's a verb. It shows us a woman can do it. It shows us other people can hear it. It shows us people do it when they're surprised. They do it when they're scared. It happens on roller coasters, etc. What's happening here is the context around the unknown word poured in and made that unknown word more comprehensible. We didn't learn a definition, we just made an uncountable number of unconscious associations with that word. You probably don't know exactly why you understood it. As I listed out what the context showed you, that it's a verb, that it's related to fear, that was probably new information to you. You weren't consciously reasoning about those things. The process of gathering that word's meaning was entirely unconscious. Some people might say, well, yes, I understand what that word could mean, but I didn't come to a definition. So therefore, the thought experiment failed, right? No. It actually shows how similar the process is to how we learn words in our native language. The reality is, the words we know the deepest are generally the words that we find it the hardest to define. Having a ready-made definition of a word is usually a sign that you actually don't know that word very well. The words that are the most core to us, like get, do, put, have, these are the words we find it really hard to define. If you try, you immediately realize how tempted you are to just try to define the word using itself.
Having something is like having something. Doing something is like doing something.
And that gets us to the root of the problem. The traditional model of language learning says knowing a word is just knowing its definition, having really fast definition recall. But if we applied that standard to our own native language, we'd come to the conclusion that we actually aren't fluent in it. Because there's thousands of words that we use every day of our lives, but we can't define them. But if we stop thinking of a word as a definition, and we start thinking of it as a sound that's had context poured into it over and over again by appearing in contextually dense situations, then the whole problem disappears. Of course, the words we know best are the hardest to define. Learning a word is not equivalent with learning a definition. Instead of thinking that words are little definitions that we're trying to force our brain to remember, it's better to think of words as a kind of bucket we're trying to fill with comprehensible experiences. And if we think of words like that, it's not just that we can learn words unconsciously, it's that we can only learn words unconsciously. And the reason for that is because an experience isn't rationally transferable. In the reality in which we live, with the current state of technology, it is impossible for me to take a collection of experiences in my head and just plug them into your brain. The best I can do is try to describe them to you, and that's really what a definition is. It's just a description. But I could describe to you what Frosted Flakes taste like, and that doesn't mean you've tasted Frosted Flakes. I could describe to you what red looks like, and that doesn't mean you've seen the color red. I could play the iPhone text tone for you and tell you, hey, that means you got a text. But that doesn't mean you're going to experience, oh, I got a text, the next time you hear that sound like you did earlier in the video. When somebody says they know a word simply because they can define it, they're making this error. The reality is, just because someone defines or translates a word for you does not actually mean you have a native-like understanding of that word. We're mistaking reading the plot summary of the movie with watching the movie itself. So we've shown 3 things so far. Our brain recognizes patterns by default. We already do unconsciously make associations between tons of phenomena, and the only way to learn a word is through comprehensible experiences. But there's actually one big unanswered question, and I think this is the question that input-based learners care about the most. Maybe you keep hearing a word over and over and over in comprehensible input, and you still just haven't figured out what it means. Does that mean that your unconscious language acquisition device is broken? No. To understand this, we have to return to the idea of contextual density. If we don't have enough contextual density, then experiences will be less comprehensible, and in the worst case, they will be incomprehensible. So let's run the gibberish word experiment again. I'm going to take a real actual word and make it gibberish, but this time, I'm also going to make other parts of the sentence gibberish as well. See how this affects your ability to unconsciously recognize the word. The word is brem. I bremmed her from the first jaunter I sprelled her. She bremmed him so much that she vorned her whole kesh for him. After 30 jaunters, they still bremmed each other. He kaleshed that he no longer bremmed her, and her tresk was porved. This time around, I imagine much less of you can actually understand the word. And if you could understand the word, I'm sure it was more difficult. And that's because we lowered the contextual density by adding more incomprehensible words. But that doesn't mean that no context was poured into brem. It just means the amount poured in might not have met the threshold for you to feel like you recognize the word. We can still say that brem is a verb, that it seems like something people do to each other, that you can do it for a long time, that you can cease to do it to somebody. Even if contextual density doesn't meet the recognition threshold, that doesn't mean that hearing the word in that context was useless. We still poured something into the word, so the next time you hear the word, well, the bucket isn't starting from empty. But what I'm trying to show here is if you lower the contextual density enough, eventually you do just get incomprehensible experiences. And if you keep seeing a word over and over and over again and you can't seem to understand it, it could just be that it hasn't yet appeared in a sentence with sufficient contextual density to make it comprehensible. What I want to do now, though, is show how we can raise the comprehensibility of those sentences without changing any of the words, just by adding more contextual density. Because contextual density isn't just about words. I think I can actually get you to understand the gibberish word brem simply by changing how I read the sentences. Don't make fun of my acting in the comments. I bremmed her from the first jaunter I sprelled her. She bremmed him so much that she vorned her whole kesh for him. After 30 jaunters, they still bremmed one another. Look at how we can add contextual density simply by changing how we read the words, as long as you have a really, really good voice actor. From my perspective, I think it makes that word pretty obvious. And that's because when we're listening to the language, our brain is not just focused on words. This is why it's called comprehensible input and not comprehensible sentences, or not comprehensible paragraphs, This is comprehensible input, and comprehensible input is made of comprehensible experiences. We track tone, we track narrative, we track intentions, we track characters, and that's only for non-visual input. When we get visual input, we add a whole other dimension of context. Gestures, images, mouth movement, location, persona. And if we're doing something interactive, again, that adds a whole other dimension of context. Now we can negotiate meaning with the speaker. Our reactions might make them slow down. It might make them re-explain. It might make them use gestures. They can do tons of stuff to adjust the comprehensibility of what they're saying to tune it to the exact level at which you can understand. That's the power of interaction. And this creates a kind of hierarchy of comprehensibility. In my opinion, it's always most efficient to learn in the environment with the most contextual density. So a quick tier list would be this. Interaction is S tier, input videos are A tier, and podcasts and audiobooks are B tier. As we descend the tier list, we trade contextual density for convenience. It's easier to watch something than to interact. It's easier to listen to something than to watch something. And that's fine, but we're not always going to be providing our brains with enough contextual density to efficiently acquire every word. I heard the word colinas in the Chronicles of Narnia, which I'm listening to now, like 80 times, and never figured out the meaning. And that's where we can use translations, grammar explanations, and just rewatching and re-listening. The further from real, authentic interaction you get, the more these tools become necessary. And some people might be saying, well, hold on. I thought we didn't have to try. I thought the entire point of this video was you telling me that we don't have to try. That sounds like trying. This is where people misunderstand what I mean by without trying. Comprehensible input is not a passive activity. Yes, the brain makes associations unconsciously. No, we don't have to try to construct them ourselves. But you still have to facilitate that process by paying attention and understanding. It's the same thing that happens at the gym. Muscle growth is involuntary. You can't decide to build muscle. You can't build muscle by concentrating on it harder. But nobody would call lifting weights passive. The growth is automatic. The lifting isn't. And we all intuitively understand that the lifting part is what we're responsible for, not the muscle growth. When we listen to the language, we're responsible for understanding the message, but we're not responsible for drilling the individual words into our brain matter. Here's a list of things it's your job to do. Pick something you can mostly follow. Pick something you actually want to watch. Keep your attention on what's happening. Notice when it's too hard and adjust. Here's a list of things it's your brain's job to do. Cut a stream of sound into separate words. Narrow meanings of those words across hundreds of encounters. Connect each one of those words to everything around it. Intuit the grammar. Your job is roughly equivalent to follow the message, and your brain's job is roughly equivalent to acquire the language. Will you sometimes subjectively feel like you're doing both jobs? Yes, especially in the beginning when recognition and memorization feel like the same thing. But as you grow further and further in your fluency, as your network of experience increases in size, you're gonna gradually feel the shift from I memorized that to I recognized that. If I could recommend you one video to watch after this, it would be my video called How Do We Know That We Know a Word? Because that video gets into the difference between memorization and recognition. And I can recommend you that video. I'm gonna put it right here on the screen. I will see you there.